Good morning. I feel a little hypocritical because I'm going to talk about being ready for things. I went down and did Karen Leftwich's father's funeral in Wichita. Went down Friday night, had everything packed, took everything, and then Saturday morning realized I had not brought my dress shoes for the service. So you can take this as with a grain of salt in the sermon. Don't worry, I got some. Matthew 25 has three parables in it. We're going to hear the other two parables the next couple of weeks, so I don't want to give too much of a spoiler. But the first one is the bridesmaids, right? So you have the ones who are ready with their oil and the ones who are not ready, and they miss the banquet. And this is sort of a key little twist in the story is how Jesus introduced this. He says, the kingdom of heaven will be like, and it's a future tense, where a lot of the parables that come before this are more descriptive. The kingdom of heaven is. And so this is a little bit of a sense of what the kingdom is going to be as it's coming. The next story that we have is, you would know it as the story of the talents, right? Which is not our skills and abilities, but it is really, the NIV translates it as the story of the bags of gold. And that is the story in which the mean ruler gives somebody 5 bags of gold, another person 2 bags of gold, and another person 1 bag of gold, and then comes back, and the key part of the story is many years later. So the idea is it's like almost a lifetime later to see what they've done with the bags, right? And you know, the first two, the one that has 5, one has 2, they double it. And then the last one buries their gold and doesn't do anything because he's afraid of punishment. The next story that falls in Matthew 25 is the sheep and the goats. And so this is the story where Jesus it's the end times and God is on the throne and there are the sheep. And he says to the sheep, you know, you are the ones that when I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. You can go on into my Father's kingdom. And the goats were you denied. When I was thirsty, you didn't give me something to drink. When I was hungry, you didn't give me something to eat. When I was naked, you didn't give me clothing. And you're set for eternal damnation. And then they reply to him, Lord, Lord, where do we see you? If you didn't do it to the least of these, you didn't do it to me. So, you know, it's this sort of prescription. So you have sort of 3 values, right? Be ready, use the gifts that God has given you to the fullest and don't bury them or hide them, and then look out for those that you can serve and you can reach out to others. How can you serve others? How can you help those around you? How can you do the things that you can? I think it's important to take that in the full context of the story and not just take this first one about being like a scout, you know, be ready, be prepared. That's really not just the part of the story. I was thinking about this, and I'm going to kind of focus in on this first story now, about things in my life that I knew about where I was taught to be ready. One of them was my grandfather, Carl Demo. He every day would get ready for the day, and he would put a couple of dollars in his wallet, and then in his pocket he had change, and he always had 2 quarters, 3 dimes, 3 nickels, and 5 pennies, so $1 worth of change. And I remember one time we were talking about it because he would lay it out, and he would get that ready, and he would go out and go about his business. And I said, why do you do that? And he says, because I can make any combination of change that I need when I'm buying something with that. And I just want to have it with me. Now, later when it was time for us to clean out his house, we found the jars of pennies, the jars of nickels, the jars of dimes that he had gathered, but he always carried with him those things. He also had a pocket knife, and he had a couple other things that he would take with him. How many of you remember maps? Okay, right. I'm not trying to, GPS is awesome, so I'm not going to lie about that. But if you remember when you would go on vacation, you would plan your trip, right? Do you remember this kind of thing where you'd actually lay it out and you'd have to kind of plan your stops? You'd think about where it'd be a good idea to get gas, this kind of stuff. Now it's really easy. Google, take me to Denver, Colorado, and arrange 3 stops, and it'll kind of do it all for you. It's really great. And how many of you know how to fold a map? That's a whole nother skill, yeah. But that was another way of planning something that you're going to do, right? You get ready, you get prepared. How many of you have an emergency kit in your car? Okay. Anybody know what you can do with a coffee can and an old metal can of corn that's empty in a car with a candle? You can make a heater, right? Okay, yeah. So, Scout. So you can be ready, right? The idea is to be prepared for the journey you're on. Now, what about your ethics? How do you prepare for that? How have you thought about how you prepare for ethical decisions? It's a little different twist, right? Or how do you prepare for your day? Or how do you prepare for difficult interactions? Or how do you prepare for good things? How do you prepare for where you're going? See, part of the story of the bridesmaids being ready, right, and having enough oil is to be attentive to the moment that they're in, but also to know what's going to happen. They were invited to meet the bridegroom, and so they had to be ready, and they had to be prepared. And that's part of the story that Jesus in the parable is trying to get us, is to be prepared and in expectation of God's presence all the time, right? Of being ready to be at God's banquet or in God's kingdom. And I think part of the challenge of being a disciple in these days is sometimes to have that sense of readiness. Last night after the service, several people came up and shared with me different ways they had been prepared in their life. One of them was a military spouse and had traveled all over the world. And one of the things she talked about was they had to have something called nuclear readiness. So they had to have their bags packed. They were in Germany at the time. They had to have their bags packed and have things ready, so if they needed to evacuate within minutes, they were able to do that. A rabbi friend of mine has shared with me multiple times, and I've actually heard this from a couple other people in the Jewish tradition. They have their passports and enough cash and a suitcase packed in case anti-Semitism or other stuff begins to happen too much. Because the generations before them, and in this particular family, they escaped from Germany and headed to Brazil. And in other people, they had had losses, but this was a reality for them. There are others that prepare for different situations that they go into or they even practice. You can talk about, firefighters or doctors or medical people will practice and rehearse when they're going into different situations. And I think part of that is to think for ourselves, how do we do some of that same work as our disciples, as we are disciples in our discipleship? Mickey Cremone was one of my ministry coaches early in my career, and we were talking one time. I was going to some meetings that I don't particularly always enjoy going to, not anything in the parish. Typically, they involve lots of other clergy, and she would sort of challenge me. She says, "Okay, you're not making the best of this," and she says, "Here's what I want you to do. I want you to make a list of the things you're going to do when you go to the meeting." And she says, I want you to name 5 people you're going to connect with that you haven't connected with before, and you're going to have that as a goal. And then I want you to have a deeper conversation with 2 of them. So you're going to choose 2 people that you're going to sit down at one of the meals with, and you're going to get to know them or ask them some advice or something like this. And then you're going to keep track of this, and you're going to let me know when I come back. And so what she was trying to do is to give a different framework, right? And to say, okay, you've got to be there. It's a required meeting. You don't want to go, but go make the best of it and figure out what you can do. It's a great chance to network, to get to know people, things like that. And so I did exactly that. I went down and I made sure I met 5 new people. Actually, I doubled that. I went to 10. And then I had some great conversations with 2 or 3 of my colleagues. And guess what? I left the meeting with a completely different attitude and forethought of that. People who teach cognitive therapy and different things will talk about this, about being prepared in the things that we do in our life, about making decisions ahead of time, about setting a path and having goals and different things like that we might do, whether it be going to a social interaction if those are tough for you, or it might be planning the trip like we talked about, or going to the interview, having these sort of ways that you go about doing stuff. So let's get back to this idea of ethics or understanding or discipleship. How do you prepare to be ethical in your life? In other words, how do you prepare to do the right thing? Sometimes that's tougher than you might imagine, right? And sometimes it's not. But you think, I'm going to do great. But you can sometimes need to really think about how you're going to interact with the world. What I mean by that is it might mean that you want to be a certain way in life. You have certain principles or understandings or gospel values that you're living in. And so how are you going to make those decisions? How are you going to plan ahead? How are you going to do that? How are you going to feed the poor? How are you going to clothe the naked? How are you going to give drink to the thirsty when you interact with others? Well, part of that is sometimes to know what you mean by that. How many of you have like a personal vision statement or have ever done that kind of work? It's okay if you haven't. That's part of that is, or maybe you've listed out your values, right? Have you ever done that kind of work? And that's part of doing that is to sort of know who you are and to be prepared. And another part of that is going into those situations or going into the different things that you're doing ready to live out the values that you have. And sometimes to be able to share with someone or with another person is to know what's enough in your own life. What's enough for your needs to be met, not your wants, that then creates space so that you can do that gospel work that Jesus is talking about. So there's a lot to kind of unpack here about that sense of being ready to be the disciple, to keep our lamps lit, to have enough oil in our stores, right? To live out this life of faith. So I want you to take some time to think about that in your own spiritual journey this week as we prepare to hear more of these lessons from Matthew 25. Next week, the challenge is going to be, how do you take the life that you're given, right? The gift that God gives you, and how do you live that life to the fullest, right? To serve others and not to squander the gift by burying it. In much the same way, we'll be called again to serve the least of these in another week as we continue on this gospel journey. So what is God calling you to be prepared for in your spiritual life? Amen.